Recently, the CFA Institute have announced changes to the way they're going to report candidates' exam results. My name's John Bone. I'm the Executive Director of Product Management for Kaplan Schweser, which basically means I'm responsible for all of the Schweser materials and the teams that produce them. So in this presentation, we're going to look at what changes to the result reporting have been made, and we'll also dive into what is the minimum passing score, the MPS. So this is the new results reporting. Now, if we look at your performance on the exam, this area here, you can see there's a little bit of a change, but not wholesale changes from previous sittings. We still see the minimum passing score represented as a thin grey line. You will still see your score as a fat grey line, and the rules, of course, are if your score is above the minimum passing score, congratulations, you've passed, and if it's below, commiserations, you haven't been successful this time. We've also got that blue box, which is just a confidence interval trying to indicate how you would perform on a good day or a bad day. So in other words, they're saying they would expect, given your knowledge on the exam, your score to range within that blue box. They've also got an administration average, and that is just the average score of all CFA candidates taking the exam. Now, what has disappeared from this is 90th percentile. So there used to be a line indicating 90th and 10th percentile. So if your score was above the 90th percentile, congratulations, you knew that you were in the top 10% of performers on that particular exam. And if you were, of course, under the 10% percentile, then you know that you were in the worst 10% of performing CFA candidates. But that has now gone, so you will no longer see 90th and 10th percentiles. What are you going to see? Well, this is new for the exam. You are going to see your score, and this is a standardized or scaled version of your raw score being number of questions you actually got correct. So you'll see your score and you'll see the minimum passing score. Now, the minimum passing score, again, this is a standardized version of the minimum passing score, okay? And it's always going to be a value of 1,600 at level 1. So again, if your standardized score is above that, congratulations, you've passed. And if it's below it, commiserations, you're looking at a resit. Okay, but what is this MPS? How's it arrived, and what do these scores actually represent? Well, let's have a look at how the minimum passing score is derived. CFA Institute tells us they use the modified Anganoff method. Now, this uses subject matter experts. So for the CFA exams, there's roughly 24 subject matter experts coming from both industry and educational fields. And the reason they come from a variety of backgrounds is so that they represent the variety or the diversity in the pool of CFA Level 1 candidates. Now, what we then do is we define what is the minimally competent candidate, otherwise known as the just qualified candidate. This is the candidate that has the minimal level of knowledge but passes the exam. So just enough performance to pass the Level 1 exam and proceed to Level 2. And what actually happens here is the CFA Institute prepare a written description of this minimally competent candidate. Okay, in other words, they will describe what knowledge they should have and what they should be able to do, and what maybe is a bit more advanced and we wouldn't expect a minimally competent candidate to do. Again, remember, it's not somebody with a strong pass, it's not somebody with a strong fail, it is somebody that is just passing and moving on to the next level of the exams. What our subject matter experts do is they then look at every single question that is in the pool of questions for the Level 1 exam. Now remember, there are different versions of the Level 1 paper, so different questions will be drawn from this pool to form a paper, and there are different papers for the exam. What they're going to do is they're going to look at the pool of all of the questions, and they are going to rate those questions. Now, when we rate questions, there's a number of ways of doing it. And the way the CFA Institute do it is they ask the subject matter experts to assess whether a minimally competent candidate will get the question correct or whether they will get it incorrect. Notice it is will get it correct, not should get it correct. So we're saying, look, will a minimally competent candidate get this question correct? Now from that, we're going to work out a cut-off score. This is the number of questions or a percentage that you need to get right in order to pass that exam. And that's a raw, if you like, the raw version of the minimum passing score. That is going to vary according to the difficulty of questions in your exam. Okay, so two different versions of the CFA Level 1 exam, drawn from the same pool but containing different questions, are going to have a different cut-off score, a different raw MPS. And then, of course, the cut-off score and your actual score are scaled and presented to you on that form that we looked at before. So this is how the process actually works. I've got a very simplified version of this here. I've got 4 subject matter experts and only 6 questions in this particular exam. And you can see that each subject matter expert looks at the question and says, would the minimally competent candidate get it correct? Or would they get it incorrect? So if we look at question 1, subject matter expert 1 says correct. Subject matter expert 2 thinks a minimally competent candidate will get it wrong, and 3 and 4 think correct. So 3 out of 4 correct. So notice we tally the total number of correct here. Okay, now the total number, we do that for every single question in the paper, okay, and we can see that we've got a total of 14 correct responses here. Now the total number of judgments is the number of SMEs times the number of questions, so 4 times 6 gives us 24. So 14 correct out of 24 total judgments means 58%, so therefore our raw minimum passing score for this particular paper is 58%. Now, we also use a load of statistical methods to make sure that these judgments from the subject matter experts are robust. So we will identify questions where the subject matter experts disagree. If you look at question 2 there, 2 said correct, 2 said incorrect. So there's a lot of disagreement there. So we might revisit that question. But they'll also look at how questions historically performed. Remember, these is a pool of questions used for multiple exam sittings, so they will have statistics on how many, for each question, how many candidates actually got it correct in the past. So they will look at this and compare it to historic data. They will also, for new questions that are coming into the exam, so rather than old questions, new questions are introduced. Up to 20 questions are actually included in your exam that are not graded. If you look back, I'm just going to flick back very briefly. We just look back here. That is this line here. Your examination may have included unscored items placed on the exam to gather statistical information. They were not included in your exam score and do not affect your score. In other words, what they're saying is 20 questions out of the total of 180, okay, so 20 out of 180 are not scored. These are essentially new questions, and what the CFA Institute is trying to do is they're trying to get some data on how candidates perform on these so that they can compare it to the results from the subject matter experts during the ANGOF process. Okay, so that's what's going on with that. So only 160 questions potentially scored in your exam. Okay, so we said we got a raw minimum passing score of 58% for this exam based on those 6 questions. Now, of course, if we drew a different 6 questions from our pool, then you might get a different result and a different MPS. So the MPS, the raw MPS, is going to move according to the difficulty of your exam. The MPS reported on your exam feedback from the CFA Institute is a standardized version. It's always 1,600. But the raw figure that it represents changes according to the difficulty of the exam. That process is known as equating. So notice the CFA records the difficulty level of each question using that modified Aganoff approach. They then adjust the minimum passing score for each candidate based on their specific exam version. So the difficulty of questions that they actually face. Therefore, if you get harder questions drawn from the pool than another candidate, you are not penalised. Harder questions are just going to be represented by a lower raw MPS. Now, of course, what they then do is they scale your scores. So you do not see the raw scores. So when you look at the MPS on the CFA Institute's results sheet, it is not the raw MPS. It's a scaled version. So they take the raw MPS and they scale it, okay, and the MPS is given a value of 1,600 regardless of what the value of the raw MPS was. Then your score is going to be reported as a number between 1,000 and 1,900. I have to say, I think the first number, 1, just represents the level of the CFA exam, because when we look at level 2, it goes from 2,000 to 2,900, and level 3 from 3,000 to 3,900. So the first digit really is just representing the level of the exam. But you can see, essentially, if you got all the questions wrong, you get a score of 1,000. If you got all of the questions correct, you get a score of 1,900. So how do they move from your raw score, which is the percentage of questions you got correct on that particular paper, to this standardized score? Well, one way of doing it is typically to use Z-scores. Now, the CFA Institute do not tell us exactly how they standardize scores for the CFA exam. And I suspect the reason for that is they don't want people to try and reverse the process and go from the standard score and try and work out what that raw score was going to be. But the common way of actually standardizing scores is to use Z-scores. Now, you might remember a bit of Z-scores from the level 1 exam. Look at a score, compare it to the mean score for that particular paper, okay, and put it over standard deviation, and that gives you a Z-score. So how far your score was from the mean in standard deviations, okay? And that means, of course, that unlike raw scores, where the difference between your raw score and the mean raw score will differ paper to paper, with a Z-score, it's removing that. Okay, it's a standardized interpretation. How many standard deviations did you lie away from the mean? What they'll then do is use a formula to convert from a Z-score into those standardized scores from 1,000 up to 1,900. So the whole purpose of this is to make sure that your score is comparable with all the other level 1 candidates, regardless of the version of the paper that they sat. So it gives you comparability across papers, exam sittings, and levels. Now, of course, the other thing that you see in your report from the CFA Institute is topic areas, and you'll see how you performed in all of the different topic areas. Now, you do not get a minimum passing score for each topic, okay, but what you do get is 2 bands, 50% and 70%, and then you can see your score. So congratulations, if your score in a particular topic area is above 70%, you perform really strongly here. If it's below 50%, then it's not a particular strong area. So you can see how you performed on each topic. Now, I think this is really useful if you are an unsuccessful candidate, because what you can then do is see where your strengths and weaknesses were on the actual exam. And this is going to therefore form the basis of a reset or an approach to a reset if I'm going to reset the exam. So here I can see I didn't do particularly well on ethics, quants, fixed income, and derivatives. Now, ethics, I think there's no excuse of performing badly on ethics, especially as we know that ethics is subject to more consideration by the CFA. They apply something called the ethics adjustment. What that means is if your score is very close to the minimum passing score for the exam, they will go back potentially and look at your ethics score, and if you did well in ethics, they'll pass you, and if you did poorly in ethics, they won't pass you. Okay, so ethics is a particularly important area, so make sure you perform well on this. So what you can see is how you did on each topic area. You can then see again a confidence interval around your score, again trying to indicate how you would do on a good day versus a bad day. You typically find the confidence intervals expand and contract according to how many questions in that particular area. So you can see that derivatives is a relatively low syllabus weighting, 5 to 8% of our exam, so fewer questions on the exam, so that gives you a wider confidence interval. Okay, again, statistics from the level 1 exam or quants from the level 1 exam, smaller number of observations, you're going to get wider confidence intervals. Okay, so very useful to see how your performance was, and therefore to structure a reset, focusing on the worst performing areas first, and then moving on to your better performing areas. Now, what I would say is spaced repetition for a resit is very important, meaning periodically set yourself a test on all topic areas, okay? And you're doing that every couple of weeks to make sure knowledge doesn't fade. The last thing you want is financial statement analysis, which here was over 70%, to drop because you focus so much of your time on ethics and quants and fixed income and derivatives that you didn't pay any attention to FSA, and it's gone from being a strength to a weakness.